I'm going to walk through something I struggled with for years starting out, but once you master these skills, you can build just about anything. To demonstrate, I'll be making a couple nightstands, and there's plans available if you want to make a set for yourself. A special thanks to Bespoke Post for sponsoring this video. The cabinets will be made using plywood with an MDF face, and I'll start by ripping the pieces to width. Now, as a reminder, whenever you're making multiples or cutting out same size parts, do it all at once and don't move your fence. If you use sheet goods with any regularity, these GSM stock guides are a splurge, but well worth it, especially if you're feeble, like me. Before I cut the miters for my case assembly, I want to take care of some edge details, but even before I do that, I'm going to cut the sides, tops, and bottoms just barely oversized on the miter saw. Because again, I'm weak and don't like dealing with 8-foot long pieces. Plus, keeping these oversized will allow me to cut off any possible tear out, which should be minimal, but you never know. Back to the edge details. First, I'm going to cut a small rabbet on the inside back portion of all the case pieces. That will eventually accept the back panel. There are a bunch of different ways you can do this, but I'm feeling saucy and opted for the router table. This is a simple rabbeting bit with a bearing your stock rides along. I have it set to take a 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch cut. Now remember kids, routers are a sneaky, dangerous tool and can catch you off guard. I gotcha. So always use push blocks. Now we can address the front edge details. Instead of a traditional thin iron-on edge banding, I'm going to use a thicker piece of hardwood so I can add some visual interest with a beveled profile. I'm milling up some leftover soft maple and poplar and taking it down to 3/4 inch square, which makes it just barely thicker than 3/4 inch plywood, which is never actually 3/4 inch because of a foreign unit of measure known as millimeters, but I digress. I hope you're picking up that keeping things oversized whenever possible is always the way to go. Like most things in woodworking, there are a bunch of ways that you could attach the edge banding. Any number of your clamps would work, or even tape does the trick. Now that these have dried, it's time to get the strips flush with the top of the plywood. Beginners generally opt for the old random orbital sander, but here are a couple different options that will offer better results. If you're feeling romantic, a couple swipes with a hand plane might give you the validation you've been looking for from old grumpy woodworkers. But if a hand plane is too boring, a quick pass with a flush trim bit also works well. Just be sure to keep the router from tipping. To cut the bevels in the edge banding, I'm going to set the table saw blade to 45 degrees and take multiple passes, sneaking up on a look that I like. I'm sure there's a way to actually calculate this, but the old taparoo fence method works great. Once I get something I'm happy with, I will cut all the remaining pieces, and just like that, we are finally ready to start making boxes. How many times have you heard or even said to yourself, that's close enough? But I've been through too many heartaches when building cabinets or something with doors and drawers to know close enough rarely cuts it. A square box is the foundation for the rest of your build, and if you mess it up, your final product could resemble a bad reveal from Trading Spaces.
Yeah, that's... Boy, she's not happy. She's really not happy.
Once you do figure out all the tricks to cutting and assembling something square, you can tackle almost any project. I need a square edge to reference for the next step, so I'll grab my trusty crosscut sled, Han Solo, and make a cut on one side of all the case pieces. And would you look at that? Old Han still has it. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be using mitered corners for my nightstands, but all of the principles we're going to talk through apply to any type of construction, and I'll show you more examples of that later when building the drawers. An old trim carpenter's trick with miters is to set your blade just barely beyond 45 degrees. That way if there is a gap when everything is assembled, it will be on the inside portion of the joint and not the more noticeable outer edges. Since the sides are a different length than the tops and bottom, I'll separate those into 2 piles. I'm placing the square edge along the table saw fence and establishing the first miter cut for all the top and bottom pieces. Once that's all done, I need to cut their opposing sides, but here's a quick tip for setting your fence distance when trimming miters to their final length. I need a cut that will yield a 20.5 inch long piece. If I set the fence to 20.5 though, it would be too big. So you want to subtract the material thickness from your desired length. In this case, my plywood is just a smidge less than 3/4 inch, so I'll subtract that from 20.5 and set the fence to a smidge more than 19 3/4. How's that for precision? Then put some blue tape on the front edge banding to help prevent any tear out since we are cutting the opposite direction. Once I double check the fence is set correctly, it won't move again until the remaining pieces are cut. You may have heard about not cross-cutting pieces that are wider than they are long, like I'm doing right now, so do whatever you're comfortable with, but I feel confident making this cut. One of the keys to building boxes that are square is removing variables, and if you've been paying attention, I removed a couple variables already. First, by guaranteeing I had a 90-degree edge to reference, then verifying my blade was set to the correct angle, And finally, not moving the fence for identical parts. Rather than bore you with more miter cuts, I repeated the same steps for the side pieces. Time for assembly. There are three main reasons a miter joint like this would need to be reinforced with splines or dowels or dominoes. Number one, you did a shit job cutting the miters and there isn't a lot of contact between the two pieces. Number two, whatever you're making will be subjected to a lot of abuse, like our coffee table the kids use as a dance stage. And finally, number three, you're building with lumber and not sheet goods, so wood movement comes into play. Since these nightstands don't meet any of that criteria, I'm telling you that despite what you've been told, this joint will be more than strong enough on its own with glue alone. You don't believe me? I've been filming this entire segment using the first cabinet that I glued up last night as a stool. Let's talk about some tricks for assembling this without the benefit of splines, dowels, biscuits, or dominoes. First, I will lay all the pieces down side by side and tape the joints. Next, you want to flip all of those over together without stressing that tape joint. I found using a big scrap of plywood like a pizza peel is the easiest way to do it. Then more tape along the insides of the joint to make cleanup a breeze later on. Now I'm applying a healthy layer of glue on all the exposed miters, letting that soak up for about 3 to 5 minutes and then coming back and applying another liberal layer of glue. This layer will sit on the surface of the first layer of glue instead of working its way down into the plies and MDF. And now it's time for pure chaos. Flip your pieces end over end and apply tape on the two ends that now meet. I think the biggest mistake I would make when starting out is not understanding the importance of clamping squares for a project like this. There are so many versions out there. I'm using a combination of very expensive but nice to have ones from woodpeckers and a significantly cheaper option from FastCap that you can make yourself. Whichever you choose isn't important. The point is if you're struggling with glue-ups, these will make a world of difference and act as an extra set of hands. I'll work my way around the box in alternating corners, manipulating the sides with squares as needed. Now once all of that is set, it's time to apply pressure to all the joints. I bought these Bessie strap clamps recently and wish I had done it sooner. I'm really liking them for glue-ups like this, and it's always a good sign when your project looks like a weird middle school science experiment. A lot of people get into woodworking to save themselves money, but they quickly learn it's just as expensive, if not worse. The real joy I get from building is being able to make something to fit my exact needs in space, like these two nightstands. No different than the sponsor of today's video, Bespoke Post. Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club delivering awesome boxes of top shelf goods from under-the-radar brands. Each box is around $70 in value, but you only pay a fraction of that price. And 90% of the products come from small brands, many of which are US based. The best thing is, you only pay for what you want. You'll get a box assigned to you each month based on the quiz you take when signing up. And before it's shipped, you'll get a preview of what comes inside to decide if you'd like to keep it, swap it for a different box on offer, or skip the month entirely, absolutely no charge. You only pay for what you want. Plus, the box lineup changes every month. I got 3 awesome boxes based on my quiz. Scorch has 6 different flavors of hot sauce because hot sauce makes everything better. Grow comes with seeds, a planting box, shears, basically everything we need to keep our herbs growing year-round indoors. And finally, Over Easy, because if you don't like cooking pancakes in a cast iron skillet and then washing it down with a Bloody Mary, well, we might not be able to be friends. To get 20% off your first box, head to bespokepost.com and enter code LSW20 at checkout, or just follow the link in the description below. Seriously, do it so I can keep making you guys videos. And this stuff is awesome too. These 2 boxes are out of the clamps, and I want to point out a couple things. First, the good. Most of these miters look great without any touch-up, and that's because of the 44.9 degree trick and the clamping squares. Also, everything is nice and square because of how it was cut, and the sheet goods are quite flat. Something to keep in mind if you're using solid wood and did a panel glue-up for the case pieces, if your glue-ups aren't dead flat, and you have a cup for instance, you won't magically correct that during assembly. And while the joint might actually be 90 degrees, a big square that hits halfway up the panel is going to make you think otherwise. The only way to fix it is with mechanical force using hidden stretchers, but that's another video for another time. The point being, there's a reason people obsess over getting flat panels. So be sure to take note of that before assembly so you don't drive yourself crazy figuring out what went wrong. Now, not everything is perfect. Some miters will need a little burnishing, and that's okay. Don't beat yourself up. Perfection simply doesn't exist in woodworking, even though it might feel that way while you're watching YouTube videos. A couple of the front edges need to be flushed up ever so slightly, and a finesse tool like a block plane is always a better option than a powered sander or even hand sanding. For whatever reason, drawers are really intimidating, but I'm going to show you a down and dirty way to build them, and once you master getting these square, you can make drawers with any type of joinery. Now, each nightstand will have 2 drawer boxes, and don't worry if you buy the plans, I've done all the hard work for you calculating spacing and whatnot. And if you didn't buy the plans, shame on you. The cheap drawer slides I'm using call for a 1/2 inch of clearance on both sides. So I'll take my internal measurements, do a bit of math that I hopefully don't mess up, then start ripping down a sheet of 1/2 inch plywood. You could use 3/4 inch plywood, but I wanted to create an economical build that uses a 3/4 inch and 1/2 inch sheet to build everything. Friendly reminder that whenever you're cutting same size parts, do it all at once and don't move your fence. You picking up a theme yet? Once I have enough strips cut out, back to Old Han to cross-cut all the pieces for the drawers. I need to cut a groove in my fronts and sides. If you're paying attention, I didn't say backs on purpose, and more on that in a minute. To cut that groove, I'm swapping out my blade to a flat top grind so it leaves a nice, smooth groove and setting the blade height to 1/4 inch. After verifying we're okay on the test piece, I will run everything through and start tapping the fence over, taking multiple passes until I get a good fit for my bottom panels. Let's talk about those back pieces I just mentioned earlier. I want my drawer bottoms to slide into place, so without moving my fence from the last groove cut, I raise the blade up to cut all the way through the plywood and run my back pieces through. This will all make more sense during the assembly. Another great habit to get into is labeling your pieces, because it's easy to lose track of sides and backs and fronts like I did. I'm shooting this scene for a second time because earlier today I made this cut on 4 of the side pieces and not the backs. I was lucky that I hadn't moved the fence yet and happened to cut spare pieces when I was ripping the plywood. Shit happens, even when you're filming a video about preventing shit from happening. Live and you learn, although it doesn't seem like I ever learn. Before I start assembling the drawers, I'll quickly sand all the inside faces and not the outsides because I can do that after everything is assembled. I mentioned these drawer boxes would be down and dirty earlier, and I'll show you 2 ways to put them together. The first and dirtiest option is pocket holes. Now, I know what all the curmudgeons are getting ready to type in the comments section. Wah, pocket holes aren't what real woodworkers use and won't stand the test of time, like heirloom furniture built by master craftsmen from the 1700s. You know what I think of most heirloom pieces? They're built very well, but they're ugly and not my style. Just like what my kids will say about these nightstands in 25 years. Also, hypothetically, let's say these screws are not strong enough, even though they are. I'll be dead in 50 or 60 years and don't care that my nightstands, which will inevitably be in a landfill, potentially have slightly wiggly drawers. Pocket holes are fine, especially for this application. How's that for a rant? Back to the task at hand. I drilled pocket holes on the front and back pieces like you saw earlier and slowly worked my way around, attaching everything with the added durability of glue on all joints. If you're not in a rush like me, using clamping squares to hold everything together is a nice safety net. Remember the back pieces we cut off earlier? Well, I cut off twice earlier. Notice how it lines up perfectly at the top of the groove so our bottom panel will slide right in once it's cut to size. The other option for fastening our dirty drawers is a simple brad nailer. This is faster than pocket holes, however the one disadvantage is the exposed nail holes on the side pieces. If you take a look at your kitchen cabinets, you'll probably see they were assembled like this and you never even noticed it until now. Sorry for ruining your day. Either option you pick is fine, and the benefit is you're not pulling against the orientation of the screws or the brad nails, so these end up being really strong. If you're asking for my personal preference, I go with the brad nailer all day because it's just simply faster and easier to execute. For the bottoms, I measure the width from one side of the groove to the other and subtract a 32nd of an inch or so, which will prevent any binding. Using the remaining plywood from the 1/2 inch sheet, I can cross-cut all the pieces to the correct width. Slide them into place and mark a line for where to trim the final dimension. But I will not attach the bottom yet. You'll see why in a bit. Cheap drawer slides like this can be an absolute pain for mounting unless you remove as much human error as possible. For starters, I cut out a spacer that I will use to set the height on the inside of the case pieces. Using an offcut from the drawer front material, I position the slides into place, then use a self-centering bit to drill pilot holes. This will keep the slides from wiggling around when I'm driving in screws. Instead of cutting a second spacer for the top slides, I simply flip the cabinet over and repeat the exact same steps. I'll be taking the same approach for installing the slides to the drawer boxes. After a bit of math, I cut out a spacer to use as a guide for positioning everything. I also have a scrap piece along the front edge to act as a stop and keep the front of the slide perfectly flush with the front of the box. The only thing to keep in mind is for your upper drawers, the spacer needs to be placed on the top edge because of the old flipperoo move I did when installing the case slides. Also, reason number 1 of 3 why I wait to install the drawer bottoms. It's just easier to clamp everything in place and handle the drawers during all these steps. But voila, just like that, easy drawer box install on the cheap. The drawer fronts will be made from the remaining 3/4 inch sheet of plywood, and I will start by ripping them down to size on the table saw and cross-cutting all the pieces to their final width. I think you're getting the gist of how that whole process works at this point. Since I am using plywood for the fronts, the edges need to be cleaned up before painting. You have a couple options, but I'm going with edge banding because it's reasonably quick and easy. This is a simple iron-on edge banding, and the glue is activated once heated up. After I do the tops and the bottom, I'll use this trimmer to flush up the edge banding to the drawer faces and snip off the ends using flush cut pliers. I have links in the description to everything I'm using. Rinse and repeat all the exact same steps for the sides. Just make sure you're giving yourself 10 minutes or so for the glue to set on all sides before you do any trimming and flush cutting. If you've ever struggled with installing drawers, stick with me because I have a couple tips that you probably haven't seen before. First up, since I'm using a single knob on each drawer, I will mark dead center on the faces and pre-drill a hole that will be used during the assembly. Next, I will get 2 screws started on the inside face of each drawer box and come back to those in a moment. For the drawer front spacing, I thought I was being really smart, and after extensive calculations was confident there would be a perfect reveal around each edge that was the thickness of 3 metal rules. But per usual, I'm not smart and forgot to account for the added thickness of the edge banding. So we are going to resort back to the old playing card trick. I stack the drawers on top of one another and get enough playing cards to slide into each opening. I'll divide that stack in 3 for the horizontal gaps and in half for the sides to be used as my new spacers. Attaching the bottom drawers is always quite easy because you can clamp the face in place and then simply finish driving the 2 screws in from earlier. But the top drawer is where it gets tricky. So here's my secret. Place your drill on the inside of the cabinet, then get everything aligned using your playing cards. I like to use green tape to act as a very weak clamp while I drill a temporary screw in the front of the face. Then reach to the back of the cabinet and finish driving those 2 screws in while applying pressure on the front of the drawer. This is also reason number 2 why the drawers still don't have bottoms. Once all that is done, I can finish installing these knobs, soak it all in for a moment, and then start taking it apart. God, woodworking is so annoying. I disassembled everything off camera and sent the boxes and faces to be sprayed by my painter, because I suck at painting. For the drawers, I'll quickly sand all the outside pieces and bottoms using 120, then 180 grit, and wiping the faces down with a tack cloth to remove any dust and debris before finishing. Speaking of finishing, whenever I'm using a birch plywood, it's my preference to keep it as naturally colored as possible, which is why I opt for something water-based like this General Finishes High Performance. The other benefit of water-based versus something like lacquer is the drawers won't be off-gassing for the next 15 years next to my face while sleeping. After the first coat is dry, a quick scuff with 240 grit, and then do it all again. Finally, this is reason number 3 why I wait to attach the drawer bottoms. It's just an easier process without them. Once it's all dried and my cabinets magically reappear in my shop painted, I can put everything back together following the same steps I did during the initial assembly. And yes, you can finally install the drawer bottoms using a little bit of glue and brad nails. Typically, this is the point in the build when I attach the back panel to the cabinet with screws. I said typically, because I can't actually do that right now. Even though we loved this paint color on the swatch, it turns out we don't love it on a nightstand. So this is all coming apart again. I gotta tell you, IKEA's not sounding too bad right about now. Ready for the plot twist? You will truly never master this, and mistakes will happen. However, learning all these skills is part of the journey towards more complicated projects. But having the right tools to measure and verify something is square is a whole other conversation. So check out this video for my recommendations on what to buy. See ya!